Netherverse looks at you and sees a hero. But do you know what I see? A coward.
April 23rd, 2013. Sony and Insomniac Games announced that a full-scale Ratchet & Clank movie is in production and set to hit the silver screen in 2015, possibly the next major leap forward for the franchise. Behind the scenes at Insomniac, plans are set in motion to begin developing a game to tie into this movie for the coming PlayStation 4. But there are a couple issues with this plan. For one, the movie would retell the duo's origin story, and there were still some threads left open with the PS3 era of RNC stories that wouldn't quite sit right if left unraveled for possibly several years. Some sort of epilogue felt necessary, but the studio already had two major projects well underway, meaning that this epilogue would have to be closer to bite-sized. After Ratchet & Clank's polarizing spin-off games had released the prior 2 years, this was a risky proposition, but the team sought this time around to return to its roots, to prove to the naysayers that it still had the chops, and to prepare for what would come after, for what could have been the biggest Ratchet & Clank game to date. Did they succeed? For over 8 years now, I've thought yes. After coming back to it with a fresh perspective, it's still a yes, with an asterisk, with missed opportunities that I feel didn't reach their fullest potential thanks to this game's short runtime and shorter development time. What else is new? This is the story of the final PlayStation 3 Ratchet & Clank game, one of the PS3's swan songs, a game released mere days before the PlayStation 4. This is Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus. If you've been watching these retrospectives for a while now, you've hopefully caught on to the one true constant of the Ratchet & Clank series. It's not titling a game with a butt joke or innuendo. It's not the prolific nature of the series, at least not anymore. It's not even that Clank is always right, although that one's close. RNC's most defining constant is what if. What if Insomniac hadn't cancelled its first PS2 project and shifted onto what would become Ratchet & Clank? What if the studio hadn't doggedly pushed itself into annual launches right as games rapidly ballooned in scope, or if it hadn't made a few, perhaps innocent overpromises that resulted in multiple straight years of crunch and burnout? What if they were able to take their time and let ideas flow and evolve freely rather than rushing from behind year after year after year after year after year for a decade? There's always something, and we all know that's true for practically every game ever made, but this game here, Into the Nexus, doubles down on that idea of what if. It's a game that incorporates the fallout of Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time before it into its lifeblood, with our orphaned Lombax Ratchet still struggling with always falling just short of finding his family. He's come a single step away from meeting his race for the very first time. Shut up. He's had the chance to not just meet, but save his father, taken away from him. He's even had to watch his mentor, the only link he's ever had to this species, to this family, and perhaps his last chance at ever finding them, die right in front of him, driven mad by the very same feeling of what if. Those sorts of little failures, they add up. Even if they're not truly failures at all, even if you did the right thing, even if you came to terms with them, they find a way to bite at you right when you think you've healed. No matter what you do during the day, at night when you're just trying to sleep, that what if, it's gonna hit you in the chest, even if you've saved the universe. Of course, Ratchet's not the only one that longs for those kinds of answers. He's not the only orphan on the block, or in the sector, I guess. The only person with regrets. See, the villain here in Nexus isn't some crazy doctor or megalomaniac, it's just a brother and sister, two kids that as infants, just like Ratchet, were sent away by their parents to some safe new home far from danger. Two kids that grew up just wanting to know, what if I could find my family? These siblings are Vendra and Neftin Prague, the latest line in writer TJ Fixman's habit of naming alien characters something that rhymes with Og. Seriously, there's Spog, there's Zog, there's Prague, there's a city named Weeblesnog in this game. It's kind of a slog. More importantly than a dumb surname, though, is that these two actually came from an alternate dimension known here as the Netherverse, which meant that in their quest to find their home, they would need a Dimensionator, the very same device that Ratchet Species had built decades ago to explore the multiverse, and the same device that had been destroyed at the end of the first PS3 Ratchet game. And unlike Ratchet and Clank, this orphan duo's feelings of what if didn't lead them down the path of being a hero. In the months prior to the events of Into the Nexus, the siblings Prague had assaulted Pollux Industries, the very same company that Ratchet also, I guess, sort of assaulted during a crack in time. The Pragues kidnapped the company's CEO and forced him to build a new Dimensionator under duress. Except, however, that the far more powerful of these two Pragues, Vendra, had been captured during the attack and given a quintuple life sentence for her crimes. Fearing an inevitable breakout attempt, the Galactic Defense Force asked Ratchet and Clank to oversee her transfer to the most secure prison in the galaxy, and although handling superpowered criminals might be business as usual in their eyes, the Defense Force's captain isn't as blasé as Ratchet and Clank.
Oh, are you worried about us?
Vendra Prague isn't like the other criminals we faced. She's cold and empty, in a way I've never seen. Promise me you won't go near her without Kronk and Zephyr, okay?
Dimensionator? Ratchet's girlfriend Talwyn actually getting screen time? Her crotchety robot uncles Kronk and Zephyr coming back for some reason? This really is a continuation of Tools of Destruction. Just keep in mind before you get too excited that Talwyn never gets to have nice things. That is actually the truest constant of the Ratchet and Clank series. She will never have anything nice happen. Although the intro of Into the Nexus is a little bit slower than what you'd usually expect from an RNC game, it's honestly one of my favorite openings conceptually across the entire franchise, setting up both the attempted quote-unquote spookier story angle as well as a super fun new gameplay tweak. As she's being awoken from cryosleep, Vendra elicits a burst of energy that knocks out the ship's power grid and gravity regulators, leaving our heroes floating aimlessly in a nearly pitch-black prison ship. Thanks to a new upgrade to Ratchet's gravity boots, though, he can now pull himself between magnetic platforms, so he and Clank slowly make their way through the ship's interior, lit only by a single flashlight as Vendra telepathically sets off elevators, rogue cleaner bots, and other traps to try and kill them. Eventually making their way out of the airlock to the exterior of the prison ship, our duo has to dodge incoming asteroids as they move to repair the generators, one small slip away from being flung into the depths of space, maybe never to recover. I wouldn't call this game scary by any stretch, even though that was the angle the folks at Insomniac took when trying to sell the game at conferences, but between some really strong, moody lighting in the style of Quest for Booty and these frightening, sort of helpless scenarios, it does a really good job of playing with those tiny little fears that so many of us have. And although this may be a coincidence, this sequence where you use the gravity boots to walk on the outside of a spaceship and make repairs is one of countless times that Into the Nexus returned to the series' classic PS2 roots and ideas, just not in a way you'd actually remember. This exact sort of idea was pitched way back in 2004 for one of Ratchet 3's cut space battles, wherein Ratchet would repair the Starship Phoenix during and after its assault late in the game. And the PlayStation 2 games get even more love just a few moments later when the Defense Force's fears are realized. Vendra's brother Neftin had at last shown up to free her from captivity, and he brought a group of paid mercenaries with him, the Thugs for Less last seen in Ratchet & Clank 2. Also, Wang Chung is canon to the Ratchet & Clank universe.
3, 2, 1, mark. Whoops.
I want to make sure you know that Wang Chung is canon. Despite their best efforts, Ratchet and Clank aren't able to stop the Progs from reuniting, and worse still, Kronk and Zephyr had been captured after rushing in ahead. For once, our heroes are helpless, forced to watch as Vendra detonates hundreds of explosives planted on the prison ship, straight up murdering Kronk and Zephyr and flinging Ratchet and Clank out into the vacuum of space. I sometimes go back and forth a little on this opening for reasons we'll get into soon, but overall, I love it as a way to set the stakes for this adventure within the first 15 minutes. It shows how unhinged Vendra is, to the point that even her brother would rather show mercy.
They're just a couple of old war bots. Isn't killing everyone
A little what?
It lets players know immediately that the spin-offs are done and dusted, that this isn't a game that's fooling around, and it's another one of those failures that'll pile on and continue to eat at Ratchet in the years to come, doubly so since those old bots were the only other family his girlfriend had left, her last connection to her missing father. Not to mention that with the PS3 and Xbox 360 era of games starting to come to a close mere days later, Kronk and Zephyr's initial gag of being bickering console fanboys, or more accurately the consoles themselves, Well, it was already kind of old when we first saw these two way back in 2007, so it's a funny little way to close that chapter and quite literally bring the PS3 era home with a bang. Ratchet and Clank are forced to leap through space between shattered magnetic pieces of the ship, avoiding and fighting the Thugs for Less troopers that are viciously chasing them down and even trying to ram into the debris to kill them. Eventually stowing away on one of these ships, the duo ends up on the abandoned planet where the Progs grew up 20 years ago, and Ratchet has to break the news to a heartbroken Talwyn.
I'm so sorry. But Clank and I are going to stop them before they hurt anyone else.
Listen to me. Come back to Meridian City.
Tal...
Please. You and Clank. You're all I have left now.
I need to make this right. I'll keep you posted.
Again, overall, I just love what this intro sets up, because it's a character piece that just focuses on what the heart of the future Saga games were meant to be about, those feelings of belonging, family, isolation, but it does so without as many of the hiccups that those earlier PS3 titles ran into due to external development pressures. I mean, that's not entirely true, there still are some hiccups here. Because this game is half the length of a usual Ratchet game, some story beats are very clearly rushed, and it just wouldn't be Ratchet & Clank without some concessions. Again, we'll get into those later, but for now, I've gotta give credit where it's due. Into the Nexus slipped almost seamlessly back into the groove after the spin-offs, and what makes it more interesting is that this game combines the PlayStation 3 story style with the old-school level design that we really hadn't seen much of since as far back as Ratchet 2. As the series began to shift from a platformer shooter back in the day to a shooter platformer, the level design too shifted, focusing more on linear combat-specific setups and wide-open battle arenas instead of providing multiple separate pathways to connect players more with each planet individually. The planets were usually the same length in both cases overall, and both versions have clear benefits. A more linear game is a bit easier to work with when you're turning around a game in less than a year, since you don't have to worry as much about players missing a necessary item like 5 planets ago and getting stuck. But a world feels far more like a world when it's not just one hallway, it's 2 or 3 or maybe even 4. The illusion of choice matters. I've heard former Insomniacs describe the old Ratchet 1 and 2 style as fishbowls with straws. At or near the start of the level, you would find a fork in the road and take one of the multiple paths, which would run through a unique area before circling back around to that opening hub so that you could immediately start the next path without having to backtrack. It's intuitive, and if done right, you'll never really notice that it's the level guiding you the entire way. It'll just feel like you yourself are doing the exploring. Although Into the Nexus only features 5 planets, one of which is just the arena, so really honestly 4 planets, it goes back to this fishbowl with straw mentality, or at least a more modern interpretation of it, and yet again, I love it in practice. Here on this first planet, Yarrick, after a little tutorial/refresher area, you'll quickly hit that fork in the road. To your left, you can investigate what the Thugs for Less seem to be doing on this planet, your classic combat-focused pathway, which ends with you finding an infobot of all things. What another throwback. When you head through the sewer system on your right, though, you'll make your way through dimly lit caves, fighting some of the local fauna and some more Thugs for Less goons, of course, on the way to the very orphanage in which Vendra and Neft in Prague were raised. This second pathway makes up the meat of the level, and it re-envisions what the story paths in this old-school style could look like. Before, you'd usually have one path dedicated to using gadgets for puzzle platforming, often leading you to another new gadget itself, and the more story-critical path focused more on the fighting. Here, there's always a little bit of both sprinkled in so that you're never doing too much of one thing in one go. On one hand, this does mean that the puzzles tend to be a bit simpler, especially since the new gravity tether gadget is about as simple as they come. Just fire at one target, fire at the other, and then you can ride an anti-gravity path from point A to B. Thrilling. On the other hand, though, it leads to this more balanced gameplay flow that leaves me more engaged with Nexus than I usually find myself when playing the other PS3 games. This game does a great job of blending the first 2 eras of RNC into this distilled and concentrated hybrid, leaving very little downtime or room for the game to fall short. Now just imagine if they had more than like 6 months to make it. Before the duo reach the orphanage, however, they find Pollux and discover why the Progs had captured him in the first place. He gives Clank the ability to open dimensional rifts and enter the Netherverse, introducing us to Clank's new gameplay gimmick. Do you remember that indie game VVVVVVV, that little 2D platformer where you could invert gravity up and down? Yeah, that, except Clank can do it in 4 directions. It's pretty cool. In these missions, you'll manipulate gravity to make your way through the level, hit different switches and solve puzzles, and at the end you'll find a sleeping nether creature that Clank has to slap so that it'll chase him back to the portal and help destroy a wall or open a path back in our main universe. I always love seeing puzzle gimmicks that use the same level design in unique ways both forward and in reverse. Actually, this is a deeper cut than I thought I'd ever make in a Ratchet & Clank video, but these give me huge Saberwolf GBA vibes. If you don't know what that is, it's one of 6 Microsoft/Xbox games that were actually released on the Game Boy Advance. I've got a whole video on it, go watch that later so that I feel some level of happiness in my life. Or don't, if you don't want me to be happy. These Clank missions are super fun for the short couple minutes that they each last, and there are a bunch of skill point challenges daring you to master each level by beating them under a time limit or without getting hit or with a set number of gravity swaps. At worst, they're harmless, and honestly, I prefer these to a good number of the other Clank styles we've gotten before or since. But this is also where I have to rip the band-aid off and say that Nexus does end up leaving a little to be desired with a lot of the cool new things that it introduces. There are only 6 of these 1 to 2 minute Clank levels in the entirety of Nexus, 3 of which are in the first 20 minutes that you have this power, and 2 of which are part of the final boss fight all the way at the other side of the game, which, by the way, is a top-tier ending encounter where we actually get to swap between Ratchet and Clank a few times as they each work separately to defeat Mr. I over here. That leaves, count 'em, 1 more for the entire middle of the game. Which again, to be fair, only makes up like 3-ish hours worth of game anyway, but the Clank stuff is just a clear afterthought to the frankly much less interesting gravity tether traversal on the Ratchet side of gameplay. Nexus does this a lot, where it brings in a fascinating new idea that doesn't end up getting nearly as much play as you'd at first like. When you reach the orphanage, the game suddenly leans into that so-called spooky vibe by trying to land a couple jump scares, by telling an atmospheric story through the old chalk drawings over the crumbling walls of the building, and also just by virtue of this being an abandoned orphanage, which gets easy creep points by default. It's odd seeing necessary backstory in a Ratchet game that's introduced by way of collectible audio logs, but that's here too, and then never again after this planet. And this wholly unique vibe that Planet Eric has sets you up and excites you for what could come after. And then after, well, the whole scary part is dropped because the mystery's already been revealed. It's not ghosts that are haunting the sector, it's just the Nethers. After the mandatory first arena challenge, Insomniac revives Ratchet 2's barely used levitator gadget, but turns it this time into a full-fledged jetpack mod for Clank, giving you free reign to explore a flooded city, and afterwards on a giant crystal hunting planet akin to those seen in the earlier games. Even better, Ratchet can get his hover boots here in this swamp too after dealing with that pesky smuggler for hopefully the final time, leaving you to your devices and just letting you have fun and go nuts. Except this is level 4 of 5. And outside of a few places where you can backtrack to grab gold bolts or rhino parts and some fun arena challenges, the hover boots still don't really reach their full potential either. Even the arena, which I think is one of the best ones in the entire series due to its unique mission variety, leaves me wanting just another taste. The unfinished hover boot race idea from A Crack in Time is finally executed here. There's a cool boss fight that forces you to use a jetpack over a lava pit. There's this thing called the Mangler, and on principle, I love it and I will not elaborate further. There's a clear ambition here, but as always, it's cut back by time limitations. This is noticeable even in the tiny things, the cut corners, such as the victory screen using a silhouette of Ratchet's Tools of Destruction pose for some reason. That's like 2 art styles ago by this point. And yet, it's all really, really, really good to the point that, god damn it, I wanted more of this. I understand that a $60 PS3 Ratchet game would have been a hard sell with the PlayStation 4 looming days away and given the sales issues the series had run into in the prior years, but generally, I love what this game does with the handcuffs on in 4.5 hours more than what a game like A Crack in Time did in 9, with a different pair of handcuffs on. I mean, let's be real, all these games have had handcuffs on. Should have named one of them Ratchet & Clank Bondage of Ultron. I don't know, I'm fucking tired. Again, not every level kills it, don't get me wrong, and that's not very good when you consider that there are only really 4 levels, but if the PS2 games were the roots, if the future Saga represented the buds that grew from those, this game's where it all really flowered, in part due to what I feel is the most complete example of the series' combat up to this point. Again, not without some drawbacks. There's still that little bit of camera stiffness that's carried over from Full Frontal Assault, like when you shift the camera around, it doesn't quite decelerate when you let go of the stick, it just kind of comes to a stop suddenly, and that can be a tad disorienting once you notice it, and the frame rate is 30, if we're lucky, but actually, oddly, it's maybe targeting 31 FPS? Once you start blasting though, you can expect it to hover around 22, so in fairness to my criticisms about A Crack in Time's inconsistent frame rate, I was always gonna rip this game for the exact same issue, y'all just gotta be patient. Anyway, my point is that despite these hiccups, the weapon balance in Nexus more than makes up for it. For the first time since Ratchet 1, where weapons had no experience gain, no matter where you are in a playthrough, or even if you're in challenge mode, any weapon feels viable. A lot of this goes back to the game's length, since the weapons only level up to 3 during your first playthrough, but I remember blasting through Nexus 3 or 4 times when it first hit just because I really enjoyed the difficulty scaling. The combat setups were more compelling than a lot of the previous games on the PS3, and the weapons just slap. And at long last, this time, that slap comes from a distance, because after 9,700 games, we finally have a melee weapon that doesn't force you to get so close to the enemies that you've got to shove your head up their arsenal and take damage, or get pink eye. Oh my god, this isn't even part of the script. I just realized that this game's big bad is named Mr. I, and he's pink. He's pink eye. He's an ass joke too. Alright, you guys can't whine anymore about these games not having innuendo. That is so good. How did I not notice that? It's kind of funny when you think about it that this game just leans so heavily into a pristine weapons balance compared to something like Deadlocked, which is deceptively about the same length as Nexus. Like, even doing every single challenge in Deadlocked only clocked me in at 5.5 hours, but that game lets you go absolutely nuts with the XP system to fulfill the classic gaming power fantasy, where Nexus instead limits you in the name of keeping you more fully engaged in all the encounters. While we're talking about upgrades, Tools of Destruction's Raritanium grid for weapon upgrades returns as well, and the Raritanium is actually back to being rare. Tools had some awful inflation, man. Here it's just one upgrade per one piece of ore, allowing you to work your way through these customized grids for each and every weapon, boosting your fire rate, ammo count, damage, and a bunch of weapon-specific bonus effects. Now, at least part of the reason that Raritanium is rare once again is because for exactly 1 year there, Sony was big about smartphone app integrations with a lot of its big releases. I'm talking stuff like Run Sackboy Run, or the critically acclaimed 90-hour narrative-driven RPG Knack's Quest, I'm lying, it's just Knack Bejeweled, or in Nexus's case, we got Ratchet & Clank Before the Nexus, an endless runner that shows the duo's fight against the Progs as explained in this game's intro cutscene. Before the Nexus is a surprisingly involved little game, with a bunch of weapons you can buy and upgrade, a lot of enemies reused from the PS3 games, and any Raritanium you earn here could be transferred and used in the real game. You don't really need it. I mean, the game gives you a pretty good amount of Raritanium just for playing anyway, so I don't know why it's here, but hey. I wouldn't call it good, since you have to tap the screen to shoot at enemies, and that means that you can't actually see the screen. It's just bad planning, but I thought it was at least neat. Plus, even though it runs like total ass, the performance in Before the Nexus is still far better than the long-rumored PS Vita version of Into the Nexus would have been. For those that want to know, by the way, if Nexus Vita was ever real, my research leads me to believe that it never left paper, that it was probably planned at one point, but never actually started production. See, since FFA on Vita was so bad and so delayed that Insomniac itself got pissed off, another likely delayed, certainly poorly optimized Ratchet port onto an already dead handheld would have damaged the series further only a few months before the movie's original release plan. It just didn't make sense to do it. And also, Insomniac sometime around 2013 to 2014 tasked that same outsourced team at Tin Giant that made Full Frontal Assault Vita with extracting data from Ratchet 1's HD remaster and making that data compatible with Insomniac's current engine for the PS4 game. So technically, without Full Frontal Assault, the PS4 game likely wouldn't have had one-to-one graphical remakes of any Ratchet 1 levels. But that's a story for next time. Anyway, going back to the Raritanium part, Nexus expands this upgrade system so well that I always just kind of assumed Tools actually did this to begin with. At each level for every weapon, the grid will start to expand, allowing you to pack in even more upgrades rather than being able to max out one gun in the game's first or second level and then never think about it again. It's a very kinetic process that keeps you improving your weapons even after they're maxed out, even well into your second or third playthrough, and it actually kinda does this better than Rift Apart did. Like in that game, the weapon-specific upgrades are absolutely crucial to the viability of many guns to the point that the individual level-ups themselves don't really feel like they mean as much anymore. But here, every gun is just fine without the Raritanium. You feel the improved kick as you hit level 2 or 3. Sure, it's a lot easier to balance this with a shorter game than a much longer one, but man, this has been as close to perfect as it's ever been. With Rift Apart and with hindsight, it's so clear that the team took Nexus as a chance to do a little sampler, to show that the old horse could still kick, and to introduce a bunch of ideas that maybe wouldn't reach their full potential here, but would be primed and ready for both the movie game and whatever would inevitably come after that. And then Marvel happened and things got a little funky. I mean, look at what Nexus does that Rift Apart essentially tried to do again, but more fully. The interdimensional travel angle, the purplish-pink rifts themselves, the hover boots being expanded further. Hell, if you want to hear a real trip, according to the RNC art book that released back in 2018, the original idea for Into the Nexus involved Ratchet actually meeting other Lombaxes from the other dimension, many of whom had been captured by the Nethers, who at that point were also going to be Tools of Destruction's Cragmites. You probably noticed if you played Nexus that the Nether enemy AI is essentially a Cragmite reskin. That's kind of why. Doing a whole story about the interdimensional Lombax society and also Lombax enslavement was too much to do properly in such a short game though, let alone an end-of-console game that almost nobody was ever going to play that was just meant to wrap everything up for a little while. So, like Deadlocked before it, this Lombax story was shelved for a few years down the road. And then Marvel happened. Don't procrastinate, folks. With how good Insomniac is at recycling canned ideas once they're actually viable, and given some of the hints in Rift Apart, I would bet more than a couple bolts that the next Ratchet & Clank story is going to be pretty close to this idea, for better or worse. We'll see. Which brings me back to the story as it actually happens here in Nexus, and although it's one of the more interesting stories thematically, with how similar the Prague siblings' backstory is to that of Ratchet's, and how Ratchet's felt that same bitter taste of longing of wanting to find family, despite how good of a thematic wrap-up all of this is, there are some clear times that they just have to rush the story along because the game's gotta be out the door in a few months. Over the course of 2 to 3 hours, Kronk and Zephyr are murdered. The Progs use their newly finished Dimensionator replica to build a Nether army. Ratchet and Clank chase them to another planet where they essentially wipe out Thugs for Less, defeat Neft and Prague, and try to make an empathetic appeal to both him and Vendra, which naturally doesn't work as she summons the rest of the Nethers, including the massive leader Mr. I, who had manipulated Vendra for years and for some reason then captures her and throws her into the Netherverse. This big stupid fucking Jabba the Hutt speaking ass monster is our final boss, by the way. Neftin immediately flips sides to work with Ratchet so they can fix the real Dimensionator, and also there's a swamp planet that just kind of exists and has a little bit of story forced into it, but really didn't need story. I truly feel that the Progs had all the pieces needed to be two of the most interesting villains in the series if this game had more time. Their dynamic, both with our heroes and between themselves, is fascinating. They're molded by their environment, abused in a negligent orphanage that leaves them searching for any way out, wondering why they were abandoned in the first place. The dimensional anomalies during A Crack in Time directly lead to Vendra being contacted by the Nethers, turning that what if into a real possibility. Neftin subverts the stupid but huge trope by being the smarter and more savvy of the two, and yet he takes so much of Vendra's punishment over the years just because she's the only family he's got. Vendra's slow-burning obsession with finding a place where she belongs, her idealized what-if, ends up turning her into a monster as she performs experiments on her brother, turning him into a monstrous half-cyborg. Time and again, we see Ratchet try to explain to these kids that, hey, look, I've been there, I get it. But the what-ifs are destroying you and the multiverse, and it's not worth it. Only for that all to be just tossed aside when Vendra gets Princess Beached in another dimension. The pieces are all here. I already highlighted so many of them on the gameplay side, but at least those felt like deliberate decisions. Here, it's somewhat of a missed opportunity. Still a worthy epilogue considering that it ties the future games together better than those games ever did, but, well, I already said it. What if? Nexus fires on all cylinders in so many respects, but the one undefeated enemy still won out: time. The animation in these cutscenes continues to thrive. Neftin's perfect camouflage is one of my favorite dumb bits in the series. The love being given to the entire franchise is so apparent, from awesome callbacks to things like Ratchet 1's infamous Rising Water segment, where needing to find and spend the hidden gold bolts to buy the New Game Plus weapon upgrades, which themselves are gold weapons just like in Ratchet 1. Composer Michael Bross really hit his groove here, creating what I consider to be the most prominent Ratchet & Clank theme that gets weaved into so many of the other tracks in the game. This soundtrack is easily the strongest since probably Deadlocked. But you're not making it 12 rounds if you're boxing with Father Time, and a handful of months just ain't gonna be enough. The Weeblesnog City level, god I hate that name, is one of the most ambitious we've seen in Ratchet, taking you all the way through so many distinct little sectors of the city, each with their own bite-sized gimmick, before eventually letting you just fly freely throughout the entire city with the hover pack, battling enemies from the sky and sweeping your way through flooded water pump systems. There's so much going on, and it's so big that 30 frames per second is a rare luxury here. It's also one of the worst levels to backtrack in, so you better not miss a collectible. The swamp level may be packed full of these great micro challenges and sort of time trials, but the level design leaves a bit to be desired once it opens up. It's just kind of a bunch of slapped together massive vines with platforms and flying enemies sprinkled in. It's really fun having that full freedom to fly around, but the level's probably too big, too samey, and too directionless even by the usual crystal hunting standard. Straight up poorly designed levels are very rare in the Ratchet series, but I wouldn't rank these nearly as highly in reality as I would like to on paper or in concept. They'd be far more innocuous if they weren't levels 3 and 4 of a 5-level game, again counting the arena as level 2. But Father Time? He don't care. Now that said, the final level is one of my all-time favorites because although the game comes to its big climax a bit early, I should not have phrased it that way, this level is everything I think I've ever wanted out of an RNC ending, and then some. It starts off with a trek through an in-universe museum, a whole exhibit to walk down memory lane and revisit all of Ratchet & Clank's triumphs over the years. There's even a redemption of the Bio-Obliterator fight from Ratchet 3, the true final boss fight that ended up cut down and slapped together due to a lack of time and resources. Essentially just one more way for the team to say, hey, guys, we know this shit just as well, if not better than you do, trust the process sometimes. It forces you to reminisce, to think back on all the adventures we've gone on thus far. It sets up this air of finality before Ratchet grabs the original Dimensionator, which for some reason is just sitting on exhibit, that's a good idea, and he sends it over to Neftin so he can repair it. Then, in the final fight itself, Ratchet just goes into this multi-phase, all-out war against the Nethers throughout a whole chunk of the city. Set in the exact same city that Ratchet defended from the Kragmites in Tools of Destruction, which again kinda makes sense here since these were supposed to be the Kragmites anyway, the two battles couldn't be any more different. Tools went for the bombastic, cinematic approach, touring you through this level to showcase the PS3's power. Nexus gives you the freedom to take down the strongest of these nether creatures in any order you'd like, and gives you a few different paths to explore before diving into those more cinematic linear moments like hover booting through traffic. And sure, I might not like Pink Eye here as a cop-out villain, but as a boss fight, up to this point in the series, it was in elite company. Dude takes a beating, even the Rhino doesn't shred him too much, forcing you to actually cycle a bunch of your weapons, making Ratchet fight upside down and across shattered gravity boot pathways, while we swap occasionally to Clank as he's working in the other dimension to free Vendra like I mentioned earlier. It all could absolutely be better if we look at all the what-ifs, but what we've got here is sure as hell satisfying. Then, once they've bounced the Nethers back to their dimension, with Neftin honoring his deal with Ratchet and taking himself and his sister to jail for the whole, Kronk and Zephyr murder, with the Dimensionator once again broken and with Ratchet still not able to find home, he laughs it off. What else can he do? The what-if doesn't matter anymore. His journey to find his family didn't end the way he wanted it to because not all heroes get that perfect ending. Not all stories have a nice bow on top.
If the Dimensionator was functional, would you use it?
The final Lombax is... I don't know. There was a time I would have said yes, but at this point, there's more for me here than over there.
But of course, those stories can tease you with more, even if Father Time finds a way to interfere. And also Marvel. It's clear that the studios seem to have this unspoken understanding that the next game after Nexus was just gonna be a fun detour, this neat little, almost anniversary kind of game, a Sonic Generations, and that after its early 2015 release, they would jump right back into the main story. Obviously, like with this entire fucking series, that didn't all go as planned, but regardless, this era still needed that ending, and this whole last hour of the game has that finality, not just for this saga, but possibly for the entire series. If Ratchet & Clank did end on this level, it would have been with a bang, even if the game leaves you wanting more, leaves you wondering, what if? But again, that's just kind of the through line of this entire series. Great games that endured the harsh, constantly shifting winds of production. Ambitious teams that always knew where to improve and what to change next time before these games were even in our hands for most of us to enjoy and for a few of us to whine about or nowadays seemingly hate play. But teams that perennially curbed those ambitions because, hey, here's a deadline, a publisher request, we've got to get started on this other project, or whatever else may have gotten in the way. There's this colossal bank of ideas from which they could withdraw years or even decades later with interest, only because every new game forced them to deposit even more than they could ever take out. Yeah, that's every game. Ask any developer, artist, anybody out there, they always want to add more, tweak more, fine-tune, make it perfect, but that's not how it works if you want to eat too. Totally unrelated, check out today's sponsor, that one's free. It's why I'm not one to harp much on Into the Nexus. A, because I enjoyed the hell out of the game, wanting more is a good thing here, and B, because these shorter games got to dip into that bank of ideas more than they could in the past, to avoid getting stale, even if maybe they didn't all work out. A game like Into the Nexus being shorter, or the long wait for something like Rift Apart, that was the cost of ambition I mentioned at the start of this PS3 saga, that eventually Insomniac had to answer to that constant grind and crunch and improve its culture, that eventually you can't put reward over consequence anymore because it will invariably destroy you. Trust me, there was a time that I wanted these full course meals every single year, and man, I sure ate well for like 75 years there. But we've eaten a lot better than a lot of other fandoms out there, and while those fans starved, I think some of us started to get fat and picky. There's a place for those big sweeping adventures every few years, and obviously I love critiquing these things and analyzing them and all that fun stuff, but I still dig these short experiments, the small team philosophies that really let the creativity show and the ideas flow, because I know and I've accepted that no matter what with RNC, two things are never, ever gonna change. There's always a but, and there's always a what if. Thanks so much for joining me on yet another journey here. It's hard to believe after well over a year of work that we're nearing the end of this retrospective saga. We've still got a couple more things to tackle though, and I've got some really fun other stuff in store in the meantime, so if you haven't already subscribed, do it already. What are you waiting for? I want to give a special thanks to my awesome patrons for their support. It means the world. A special shout out to my Silver and Golden Bolt tier supporters. Oh dear God, this list got so much longer. I just pulled it up. I'm not going to do it in one breath, but I'll sure as hell try. Goldstorm07, Anon42, Cloudy Boy, Karigane564, Malcavio, Philly D360, Phyrexian Sleeper Agent, Rodney220, the FOE3, Captain Squid, Cooking Mama, Eclipse 2025, Even Luck, Faisal B, Harry, Heidi, Hotzi, I pay my cam girls, so why not you? That's a good name. Ibathon, James Boss, Justin Gregoire, Litlinks, Lupine Pariah, Philip E, Shadow Nexa, Tabri Sadiq, Terminally Nerdy, William Bundy, and Buckles Chucklow. If you'd like to get ad-free and early versions of all of these videos, access to the Golden Bolt Discord server, and much more, visit patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. As always, thank you again, and until the next time I see ya, stay golden.